On a moonless night in the Southwest Pacific, early 1942, a U.S. submarine's torpedo room was so quiet you could hear metal contracting with the cold. The boat had been stalking a Japanese convoy for hours, riding deep and slow, saving battery, waiting for the one clean angle that makes a warhead count. When the moment finally came, the captain ordered tubes opened and firing data confirmed. Men moved with the ritual confidence of training, final checks, last signals, then the heavy, unmistakable lurch as the first torpedo left the tube. A few minutes later, the sound everyone waited for arrived, an impact. A dull, solid hit transmitted through water like a knock on a steel door. In the control room, shoulders tightened. Someone whispered, not as prayer but as routine, "Now." Nothing happened. No bloom of underwater violence. No broken ship. No rising flame. Just silence followed by the most humiliating sound in submarine warfare, the convoy continuing on as if the attack had been imaginary. The captain ordered another shot, then another. Again, at least one torpedo hit. Sometimes the crew could even hear it strike, yet still no explosion. In the worst cases, torpedoes didn't just fail, they betrayed their own boat by revealing its position while doing no damage. The submarine had taken the risk, entered the kill zone, exposed itself to escorts, and gotten nothing but proof that its primary weapon could not be trusted. This wasn't a rare malfunction. It became a pattern. It became a fear. And soon it became a name spoken with disgust inside the U.S. Submarine Force. The Mark 14 torpedo, armed with the Mark WWII exploder, a weapon so plagued by real-world failures that crews began to treat every perfect shot as an experiment rather than a kill. By the time America entered the war, the submarine service carried an enormous strategic responsibility. Submarines were expected to choke Japan's supply lines, sink shipping faster than it could be replaced, and force the enemy to fight with starvation creeping into its logistics. Unlike surface battles, rare, decisive, and expensive, submarine warfare was supposed to be relentless, a steady strangulation. But for that to work, submarines needed one thing more than courage or tactics. They needed torpedoes that detonated when they hit. On paper, the Mark 14 looked like a masterpiece. It was fast, long-ranged, and designed to deliver a massive warhead against merchant shipping and warships alike. It was supposed to be the silent equalizer, allowing a single submarine to cripple an enemy far stronger in surface tonnage. The Mark WWII exploder was even more ambitious. It offered two ways to kill: a contact detonation when the torpedo struck a hull, and a magnetic influence detonation designed to explode under a ship's keel, breaking its back with the most efficient shock possible. In theory, it turned physics into slaughter. This is what procurement loves: elegance. A solution that doesn't just meet requirements but surpasses them. A weapon that appears to multiply effectiveness without multiplying risk. Because it was designed in an era when secrecy and confidence often replaced skeptical testing, it entered the war with an aura of certainty. Submarine skippers believed they were carrying the sharpest knife in the fleet. Then combat exposed the truth. The weapon had not been properly tested under the conditions that mattered. The first problem was depth. In real attacks, Mark 14 torpedoes tended to run deeper than their settings. That sounds minor until you understand what it means in practice. Submarine attacks are not broad guesses, they are geometry. A solution is built on assumptions about where the torpedo will be at a given time. If the torpedo runs deeper than expected, it can pass beneath a target that should have been dead. The periscope shows a perfect track. The crew hears nothing. The enemy sails on. The captain rechecks his data and concludes at first that he must have miscalculated, so he tries again, and the pattern becomes something darker than bad luck. The second problem was the magnetic influence feature, supposedly the most sophisticated part of the system. In certain conditions, the magnetic detonator triggered prematurely. A torpedo could explode before reaching the target, sometimes at a point that wasn't just wasted but dangerous. A premature detonation could warn the convoy, alert escorts, and send depth charges hunting the submarine that had just revealed itself. That kind of failure doesn't just lose an opportunity, it invites retaliation. And then came the most enraging defect of all, the contact exploder failing to detonate on impact. This was the one that broke crews psychologically, because a non-detonation on impact isn't a miss. It's proof that the crew did its job and the weapon refused to do its own. Sailors described hearing and feeling the strike through the boat. Some reported seeing the torpedo hit through the periscope, a visible confirmation that their solution was correct. And then nothing. The torpedo became a blunt instrument instead of an explosive weapon. It could hit and bounce. It could hit and die. It could hit and turn a lethal mission into a pointless act of self-exposure. In the cramped, sweating machinery of a submarine, that kind of failure doesn't remain technical. It becomes personal. Submarine warfare already demanded a particular kind of nerve, the willingness to close on a target, fire, and then endure the counterattack. Depth charges hammering the hull, lights flickering, gauges trembling, men holding their breath as water pressure tried to crush them. When torpedoes worked, that fear had meaning. The risk brought results. When torpedoes failed, the risk became meaningless suffering. Crews felt like they were being asked to die for a defective product. And that is how trust collapses. At first, captains and crews tried to explain it away. They blamed themselves, bad angles, wrong speed estimates, faulty periscope range, misread target course, but the reports multiplied across boats, across patrol areas, across months. Different commanders, different oceans, different targets, same outcomes. Hits without explosions, explosions without hits, misses that didn't make sense. A weapon that behaved like it had a mind of its own. The result was a slow, corrosive shift in doctrine, not written on paper but written in behavior. Skippers began firing more torpedoes per target than doctrine recommended, not because targets demanded it, but because they assumed a percentage would fail. That meant fewer torpedoes available later in a patrol. It meant submarines returning to port with fewer kills than their opportunities justified. It meant Japan's shipping surviving encounters that should have been massacres. Some crews began disabling the magnetic feature when they could, because a torpedo that detonates early is worse than one that detonates late. Better to rely on contact, except contact was also unreliable. So they were left choosing between two broken options. Imagine what that does to a commander's mind. In submarine warfare, the captain is supposed to be aggressive but calculating. He is supposed to hunt, but hunting requires confidence in the kill. Without that confidence, the captain becomes cautious, because each attack becomes a gamble where the odds may not justify the risk. That caution is invisible on a map, but it is catastrophic strategically. By mid-1942, the problem was no longer just tactical frustration. It was a strategic failure. Submarines were supposed to be a decisive tool in the Pacific. Instead, many patrol reports read like the same nightmare repeated. Excellent approach, perfect firing solution, confirmed hit, no detonation. The enemy learned to fear submarines less than it should have. Escorts grew bolder. Convoys tightened. The psychological advantage shifted. And the most dangerous part was that the system responsible for the torpedo, the bureaucracy, did not immediately accept the reality from the front. When an institution has invested prestige and money in a weapon, it tends to defend the weapon before it defends the user. Early on, many complaints were treated as operator error. Procedures were emphasized. Training was blamed. Captains were second-guessed from desks far away from depth charge explosions. That institutional denial extended the crisis, because until a problem is admitted, it cannot be solved at the scale required. Submarine skippers were essentially being told that their eyes and ears were lying, that their crews were incompetent, that the weapon was fine. But the ocean doesn't care what a memo says. The ocean produces outcomes. Eventually, the submarine force pushed back harder, not politely, but with the urgency of men who knew they were being sent into combat with a defective main weapon. The pressure built through repetition and embarrassment. Reports became impossible to ignore because they were not isolated and they were not ambiguous. This wasn't one skipper complaining. It was an entire force describing the same failures under real combat conditions. The fixes, when they finally came, were as humiliating as the problem itself. The weapon needed to be tested properly, corrected systematically, and stripped of features that did not work in reality. The magnetic influence function was curtailed. Depth keeping was addressed. The contact exploder mechanism had to be corrected so that an impact actually produced detonation instead of a silent failure. Only after painful months did the torpedo begin to behave like the weapon it had been advertised to be. And when it finally did, the change was dramatic. Submarines began to deliver the strategic strangulation they had been promised. Japanese shipping losses rose. Convoys became harder to protect. The Pacific logistics machine began to bleed. That later success cannot erase the early betrayal, because for the men who lived through the torpedo crisis, the Mark 14 wasn't just a weapon with early problems. It was the reason missions failed that should have succeeded. It was the reason boats survived attacks they shouldn't have needed to endure. It was the reason enemy ships sailed away when they should have been wrecks. It was the reason some crews stopped trusting the most fundamental thing in their war, that when they hit the target would die. The lesson is as old as war but repeated in every generation. Testing that avoids realism is not testing, it is theater. A weapon is not proven by controlled trials and confident paperwork. It is proven when cold, pressure, stress, and chaos try to break it. The Mark 14 entered the war unbroken only because it had not been forced through the kind of trials combat provides for free. And the cost of that mistake wasn't paid by the engineers or the bureaucrats who signed off the design. It was paid inside steel hulls beneath the sea, by crews who did everything right, then listened to silence after impact, and realized the weapon in their tubes could not be trusted. In submarine warfare, trust is survival. When the weapon fails, the crew doesn't just lose kills, they lose faith. And that is how a jammed, failed, unreliable weapon becomes more than a defect. It becomes a betrayal that shapes an entire war.